On a Tuesday morning in February 2009, a man in Penrose, Colorado unlocked a storage room and began boxing up the last of it. Fuel tanks, glow heads, crankcase parts, 60 years of American precision engineering, sorted into cardboard boxes and sold off to strangers on the internet. There was no announcement, no ceremony, the press did not come. But somewhere in the memory of every American man who grew up in the 1950s, 1960s, or 1970s, something already knew. The smell of nitromethane on a Saturday morning, the sting of a propeller across your knuckles, that sound, half mosquito, half machine gun, screaming circles above a backyard somewhere in the middle of an ordinary American afternoon. The Cox .049 engine powered a generation. It cost less than $4. It was machined to tolerances tighter than a surgeon's instrument. And the men who finally killed it didn't even know what they were throwing away. Leroy Cox grew up in his father's bicycle shop in Placentia, California. Not a factory, not an engineering school, a bicycle shop, where a kid learned that small machines, properly made, could carry a person somewhere they couldn't go on their own. He never forgot that lesson. By the time World War II ended, Cox was in his late 30s, working as an electrician, watching metal come back into the American economy after years of wartime rationing. He saw the opening. In 1944, he started making wooden pop guns in his garage, simple toys sold to local school kids, assembled by neighborhood women working part-time around their households. It was not glamorous, but it moved product. And Leroy Cox was a man who understood that the distance between a garage and a factory was mostly a question of how badly you wanted to close it. When metal became available again after the war, he pivoted. By 1946, he had moved out of the garage and into a small building on Poinsettia Avenue in Santa Ana, California. He was building tether cars now, miniature racers that spun around a center pin on a string, powered by tiny gasoline engines. The cars sold for $19.95. In their first year, they generated $200,000 in revenue. But Cox was already looking past the cars. The model airplane market was growing fast in post-war America. Returning veterans had seen real aircraft up close, had worked on them, flown in them, some of them flown them, and they were coming home with a mechanical vocabulary and a hunger to build things with their hands. Their sons wanted to fly. The hobby industry was moving to meet them, but it had a problem. The engines were unreliable, hard to start, inconsistent. The kind of product that made a boy give up before he ever got off the ground. Cox spent the better part of 1950 solving that problem. He worked on a new engine, 0.049 cubic inches of displacement, barely larger than a man's thumb, designed from the ground up for easy starting, consistent power, and a price point that a father could justify on a Saturday afternoon without thinking twice. He called it the Thimbledrome Space Bug. It hit the market around October of that year, priced at $6.95. The modelers found it immediately. Word spread through flying clubs and hobby shops the way word always spreads about something that actually works. The Space Bug started when you told it to start, it ran when you needed it to run, in a market full of temperamental hand-machined engines that required the patience of a watchmaker and the luck of a gambler. That was not a small thing. That was everything. Within 2 years, Cox was running print ads in model airplane news. Within 3, he had built a new factory in Santa Ana with 250 people on the floor. He had designed his own production machinery. Not content to rely on equipment built for other purposes, Cox engineered the tools that would make his engines with the consistency he demanded. Every crankcase, every cylinder, every piston, made in California, made to standard. In 1952, a young engineer named Bill Selzer came to work at Cox. He had been trained at Pratt & Whitney, the company that built the engines that won the war. He was precise, methodical, and possessed of an engineer's particular impatience with unnecessary cost. Leroy Cox recognized the type immediately, because he was the same type. What Selzer would design 4 years later would change everything, not just for Cox, but for every small engine manufacturer in America. Most of them would not survive what he built. For now, though, the factory hummed. The orders came in, and in backyards and school parking lots and open fields across the country, boys were learning for the first time that a machine no bigger than their fist could make something fly. That was enough. For a while, it was more than enough. In 1956, Bill Selzer solved a problem that no one else in the industry had thought to solve the right way. Every small engine manufacturer in America was building crankcases the same way, casting them in aluminum molds one at a time, cooling them, pulling them, finishing them. It worked, but casting was slow, and slow meant expensive, and expensive meant the engine sitting on the hobby shop shelf cost more than most fathers wanted to spend on something their son might crash into a fence post on the first afternoon. Selzer looked at the process differently. Cox was already purchasing extruded aluminum bar stock, raw material that arrived at the factory in lengths of 40 to 50 feet. The exterior profile of that bar was already the finished shape of a crankcase. All you had to do was feed it into a machine and cut the interior out. Selzer designed that machine, and when it ran, it produced finished crankcases faster than a man standing at the output end could blink. The engine that resulted was called the Babe B.049. It sold for $3.95. For a precision-machined glow-plug reed valve engine that started reliably, ran consistently, and could be mounted in a ready-to-fly airplane purchased at Sears Woolworths or the local hobby shop on a Friday afternoon and flown in the backyard by Saturday morning. The competitors never recovered. Herkimer, Holland, K&B, Anderson, Fox, McCoy, every company that had been building die-cast crankcase engines at higher price points watched their market collapse in the space of a few selling seasons. The Babe B did not just outsell them, it made their business model obsolete. By the late 1950s, Cox was not simply a hobby company. It was the engine of American model aviation. Walk into any hobby shop from California to Connecticut, and the Cox display was the centerpiece. Rows of Babe Bs in their yellow and black packaging, stacked beside ready-to-fly P-40s and PT-19 trainers and Piper Cubs, all of them waiting for the right Saturday and the right kid. In 1957, Leroy Cox pulled off something that no other hobby manufacturer had ever managed. He got his planes into Disneyland. The Thimbledrome Flight Circle opened near Tomorrowland that summer. On an hourly basis, Cox pilots flew U-control demonstrations in front of crowds that arrived by the thousands every single day. Children pressed against the railing and watched aluminum-winged aircraft scream circles overhead, pulled taut on steel control lines, banking and climbing on command. Cox had a hobby shop right there stocked with RTF models and engines, positioned at the exact moment when a child's imagination was most open and most vulnerable to a product that promised the same experience. Hundreds of thousands of people saw those planes fly. Many of them bought one before they left. The factory in Santa Ana ran 3 shifts. The parking lot filled before sunrise. Inside, the crankcase machine ran continuously. Those 40-foot bars of aluminum feeding in one end, finished crankcases coming out the other in a rhythm that never stopped. Cylinders were machined to tolerances of 25 millionths of an inch. Not because the market demanded it, because Bill Selzer demanded it, and Leroy Cox agreed that a product with his name on it would be built to the standard he set, or it would not leave the building. The men on that floor knew what they were making. They were not assembling toys. They were building precision instruments that happened to be sold in toy stores. The distinction mattered to them. You could see it in the way they handled the parts. The particular care of workers who understood that the thing in their hands was going to end up in a kid's backyard, and that kid was going to judge the whole enterprise by whether it started on the first pull. Through the early 1960s, Cox kept pushing. In 1961, the TD series arrived, a throttled engine line capable of powering radio-controlled aircraft, designed for competition flyers who wanted precision beyond what the Babe B offered. Cox hired Bill Atwood, already a legend in small engine design, to develop new variants at the lower end of the displacement range. The product line expanded to more than 50 engine models. The name appeared in hobby publications, flying club newsletters, and department store catalogs from one end of the country to the other. There was a boy in almost every neighborhood in America who owned one, or wanted one, or had a father who had flown one and still talked about it. None of them knew this factory had already begun to change hands, and the men who would eventually own it had very different ideas about what precision was worth. In 1969, Leroy Cox sold his company and retired. He was 63 years old. His first wife had died the year before. The business he had built from a garage on Poinsettia Avenue was now generating revenues that would exceed $25 million a year under new ownership. By any measure, Roy Cox had succeeded. He had democratized model aviation. He had put a precision engine in the hands of a generation of American boys at a price their fathers could afford. He had done what he set out to do. What came next was not his fault, but it was his company that bore the cost. The buyer was Leisure Dynamics, a Minnesota-based holding company that owned a portfolio of hobby and recreation brands and understood each of them the way a landlord understands a building, as an asset to be managed, not a craft to be protected. Leisure Dynamics knew how to read a balance sheet. What it did not know, what it perhaps never tried to know, was why the Cox engine worked the way it did, and what it would cost to stop doing it that way. For a few years, the numbers held. Bill Selzer stayed on and was appointed president of the Cox Manufacturing subsidiary in 1970. The engine line continued. The Babe B kept selling. From the outside, the machine looked exactly as it always had. But in 1971, Leisure Dynamics made its first structural decision. It split the company in two, moving model production up to Minnesota while leaving engine manufacturing in Santa Ana. The logic was administrative. The consequence was something more corrosive. For the first time in Cox's history, the people who made the engines and the people who designed the products those engines would power were no longer in the same building, talking to each other across a factory floor. The integration that had made Cox great, the feedback loop between engineering and product, between what the engine could do and what the airplane should ask of it, began to fray. Through the mid-1970s, the warning signs accumulated quietly. The slot car market that had helped sustain Leisure Dynamics was collapsing. Electric RC systems from Japanese manufacturers, OS Engines and Kyosho, were arriving in American hobby shops with throttle control and refinement that the Cox line, built around the fixed throttle simplicity of the Babe B, could not easily match. The hobby was bifurcating. On one side, the mass market of backyard flyers who wanted something cheap and easy. On the other, a growing community of serious RC pilots who wanted something that the Cox catalog was not designed to provide. Leadership at Leisure Dynamics responded the way holding companies typically respond to a market that is moving away from them. They added products. They changed names. In 1976, the parent company rebranded to Cox Hobbies Inc., acquired a radio manufacturer, and pushed into new categories. The moves looked like growth. They were, in retrospect, the financial equivalent of a man running faster to avoid noticing that the ground beneath him was giving way. By the late 1970s, the Santa Ana floor was quieter than it had been. Not empty, but quieter. Overtime had pulled back. Some of the older machinists who had been there since the Spacebug days were retiring and not being fully replaced. The crankcase machines still ran, the Babe B still shipped. But the rhythm of the place had changed in the way that rhythms change when a company begins spending more energy on its problems than on its product. The men on the floor noticed. They always notice before management says anything. You feel it in the scheduling changes, in the meetings that produce nothing, in the particular way a supervisor avoids your eyes on a Friday afternoon. Nobody said anything out loud. The Cox name was still on the box. The engine still worked. And in living rooms and basements and hobby shops across America, boys who had never heard of Leisure Dynamics were still pulling a spring starter and listening for that sound. They did not know that the company making their engine was already in trouble. They did not know that the man who had saved it once would soon be called upon to save it again. And they did not know that even he would not be able to save it forever. In 1980, Leisure Dynamics filed for bankruptcy. It took Cox Hobbies with it. The filing was not a surprise to anyone who had been watching the numbers. Leisure Dynamics had overextended across too many hobby categories during the 1970s, chasing markets that were contracting faster than the company could adjust. The slot car business had already collapsed industry-wide. The RC market was being carved up by Japanese manufacturers with better technology and lower production costs. The holding company that had bought Cox for its cash flow had instead consumed it, pulling resources toward corporate overhead while the engineering culture that made the product worth selling quietly eroded from within. The Santa Ana facility did not close immediately, but the bankruptcy froze everything. Purchasing decisions stalled, production schedules became uncertain. The men on the floor came in each morning not knowing whether the supply chain would hold through the week. Machinists who had spent 20 years building engines to Bill Selzer's tolerances now stood at machines that might or might not be running by the following month. Leroy Cox, who had sold the company 11 years earlier and retired to Corona Del Mar, died on September 22, 1981. He was 75 years old. He had lived long enough to watch the company he built from a garage fall into receivership. Whether he understood what had happened to it, whether he had the full picture of what Leisure Dynamics had done with the thing he spent 30 years building, is not recorded. What is recorded is that he died while the company still bore his name and still could not make payroll with any certainty. The irony was total. The man who had democratized American model aviation, who had put a precision engine in the hands of a generation of boys at a price their fathers could actually pay, died while his company sat in bankruptcy court waiting for someone to decide whether it was worth saving. Someone decided it was? In 1983, Bill Selzer, the engineer who had come from Pratt & Whitney 30 years earlier, who had designed the Babe B and the extrusion process that made it possible, who had served as president under Leisure Dynamics and watched the holding company dismantle what he had helped build, purchased Cox out of bankruptcy. He brought in a local businessman as a partner. He moved all manufacturing back to Santa Ana, and he rebuilt. It was not a small thing to do. The tooling was still there. The knowledge was still there. Selzer carried it himself, had encoded it in the machines and the processes and the tolerances he had established 3 decades earlier. What had been broken was the organizational structure around the engineering, not the engineering itself. Selzer stripped away what Leisure Dynamics had layered on top and returned to what Cox had always been. A precision manufacturing operation run by people who understood what they were making and why it had to be made exactly right. Through the mid-1980s and into the 1990s, Cox recovered. New products were added. The facility moved to larger quarters in Corona, California in 1990. The Babe B and the Pee Wee stayed in production. In 1995, the company celebrated its 50th anniversary with new engine releases and RTF models. For a moment, for a genuine earned moment, it looked like the story might end differently than the industry expected. But the market was moving in a direction that no amount of engineering excellence could fully arrest. Japanese manufacturers had spent the 1980s perfecting throttled glow engines for RC aircraft. By the 1990s, OS engines and their competitors offered products with a refinement and feature set that the Cox line, built around the elegant simplicity of the fixed-throttle Babe B, was not structured to match at competitive price points. Electric RC systems were improving every year, quieter, cleaner, easier to operate, requiring none of the fuel mixing and needle valve adjustment and glow head replacement that the nitro hobby demanded of its participants. The backyard was changing. The patience required to start a 049 and tune it by ear was becoming a skill that fewer and fewer newcomers wanted to acquire. Cox lost money in 1991, and 1992, and 1993, and 1994. 4 consecutive years in the red, each one narrowing the options available to the men trying to hold the company together. By the end of 1994, Selzer and his partner had made a decision. If Cox did not turn a profit in 1995, they would close it. It turned a profit in 1995, small, fragile, but real. And then a white knight appeared, the way white knights always appear in these stories, arriving just in time to prevent the immediate crisis while setting the conditions for a slower and more complete destruction. Estes Industries, the model rocket company out of Penrose, Colorado, founded in 1958 by Vern Estes, beloved by an entirely different generation of American boys who had grown up launching cardboard tubes into the sky on Saturday mornings, offered to buy Cox. On January 6, 1996, for $6 million, the deal closed. Bill Selzer, who had saved the company once and spent a decade fighting to keep it alive, signed the papers and walked away. He had done everything a man could do. He had built the engine that defined the hobby. He had rescued the company from one bankruptcy and nursed it through a decade of market pressure. And in the end, the only move left was to sell it to someone who had the capital to keep the lights on. What Selzer could not have known, or perhaps chose not to examine too closely, was what Estes would do next. By the end of that year, the only question left was not whether Cox would survive as it had been. That question had already been answered. The only question that remained was how much would be lost before anyone admitted it. Estes Industries understood model rockets. It understood cardboard tubes and black powder igniters, and the particular joy of a 12-year-old watching something he built disappear into a blue sky at 200 feet per second. It understood mass-market retail, catalog sales, the economics of a hobby product sold in chain stores to first-time buyers who wanted simplicity above all else. What Estes did not understand was precision engine manufacturing. That gap between what Estes knew how to do and what Cox required someone to know how to do would define everything that happened next. Not out of malice, not out of indifference to quality exactly, but out of the particular blindness that afflicts a competent organization when it acquires something outside its core competency and assumes that competence in one domain transfers automatically to another. For the first 18 months, Estes kept the Cox operation running in Corona, California. The engineers were still there. The machines were still there. The Babe B still came off the line the way it always had. Crankcases extruded, machined, anodized, assembled by hands that had done it thousands of times before. If you bought a Cox .049 in late 1996 or early 1997, you were likely holding the last version of the engine made the way Bill Selzer intended it to be made. Then Estes moved the operation to Penrose, Colorado. The relocation itself was not the fatal decision. Companies move, operations consolidate. What happened in the process of that move, the specific choices made in the specific weeks when the Corona facility was being dismantled and its contents inventoried for transport, was where the damage became irreversible. Estes looked at the crankcase extrusion machine and made a calculation. The machine was large. The machine was specialized. Moving it was expensive, and Estes had determined that it would be more cost-effective to subcontract the primary machining operations, to have someone else cut the crankcases, and then do the finishing work in Penrose. The extrusion machine went to auction. The buyers who took it away had no connection to Cox and no intention of making Cox crankcases. They simply needed the equipment for something else entirely. Bill Selzer's machine, the one he had designed in the 1950s, the one that had produced crankcases faster than a man could blink, the one that had driven the price of the Babe B to $395 and put a Cox engine in the hands of every American boy who wanted one, was sold at auction and hauled away. The men who had run it were not offered positions in Penrose. What followed in the Colorado facility was, by the accounts of the people who watched it happen, a slow and painful unraveling. The subcontracted machining never achieved the tolerances that the Santa Ana and Corona lines had maintained for decades. Engine parts from different production runs were mixed and matched to fill orders. A cylinder from one batch, a crankcase from another, assembled together in combinations that Selzer's original specifications had never contemplated. The quality control that had been the defining characteristic of the Cox engine, the thing that made a boy's father trust that the product in the box would actually work, began to fail in ways that were visible to anyone who had ever run a real Cox engine and knew what it was supposed to feel like. The hobby press noticed. The collector community noticed. Forum posts from the late 1990s and early 2000s document the change with the particular precision of people who care deeply about something and are watching it be destroyed. The engines that came out of Penrose were not the engines that had come out of Santa Ana. The name on the box was the same. The product inside was not. Estes compounded the problem by expanding the Cox line into electric radio-controlled models, products that had nothing to do with the 049 engine, nothing to do with control line flying, nothing to do with the 40 years of identity that the Cox name carried for the generation that had grown up with it. Some of those electric products failed catastrophically. A product recall followed. The Cox name, which had spent half a century representing precision and reliability, was now appearing in news items about consumer product safety. One by one, the classic engine models were withdrawn from the catalog as existing inventory sold through and was not replenished. The Babe B, the Pee-wee, the TD. Each one disappeared from the active product line without announcement, without ceremony, without any acknowledgement that something irreplaceable was leaving with it. By the mid-2000s, what remained of the Cox engine line was inventory. Not production, inventory. Boxes of parts and assembled engines that had been manufactured years earlier, sitting in a warehouse in Colorado, being sold down slowly through a website and through hobby distributors who still carried the name. On February 7, 2009, Estes Industries made it official. They stopped selling Cox engines entirely. The remaining stock, spare parts, glow heads, fuel tanks, the accumulated remnants of 6 decades of American precision manufacturing, was boxed up and sold to private buyers in the United States and Canada. Men who had loved the engine, who had grown up with it and collected it and written about it in forums for years, purchased what they could. They understood that what they were buying was not inventory. It was evidence. Proof that something had existed. Proof that for 50 years in a factory in Southern California, American workers had machined aluminum to tolerances tighter than a human hair and sold the result for less than the cost of a movie ticket. The warehouse in Penrose was quiet after that. No machines running, no crankcases coming off the line, just the sound of cardboard boxes being sealed and loaded onto trucks, heading toward collectors who would store them carefully and run them gently and remember, every time they did, what it had once felt like when these things were everywhere. The Cox name did not disappear. It never does, with brands like this. Mekoa, the Model Engine Corporation of America, eventually acquired the Cox intellectual property after Habaco's own bankruptcy in 2019. The name exists today. You can find it online. But the machine that made the engine is gone. The men who ran the machine are gone. The factory that housed them both is a memory in a city that has mostly moved on. What remains is the name, just the name. The building on Poinsettia Avenue in Santa Ana is still there. It is not a factory anymore. It has not been a factory for a long time. The men who fed 40-foot bars of aluminum into Bill Selzer's extrusion machine, who stood at the output end and watched crankcases emerge faster than they could count them, who spent their working lives building something small enough to hold in one hand and precise enough to shame a Swiss watchmaker. Those men are in their 70s and 80s now, if they are still here at all. Most of them never found another job that paid as well or asked as much of them. Precision manufacturing of that kind does not relocate. It does not retrain. When it leaves a city, it leaves completely. The hobby shops that once stocked Cox engines in their front windows are mostly gone too. The ones that survive have shifted toward electric RC, drone components, simulator software, products aimed at a different kind of hobbyist with a different relationship to the machines they fly. The wall of yellow and black Cox packaging that once anchored the model aviation section of every Sears and Woolworths exists now only in photographs that collectors post in online forums, tagged with the particular wistfulness of people documenting something they know will not come back. The collectors themselves are the living archive of what Cox built, on forums like Cox Engine Forum. Men who grew up in the 1960s and 1970s spend their retirement years cataloging engine variants, tracking serial numbers, sourcing NOS glow heads from the dwindling supply that private buyers picked up in February 2009. They write detailed histories of the die-cast crankcase experiments. They debate the relative merits of the Babe B versus the TD with the kind of precision and passion that the engines themselves were built to inspire. Some of them still fly. Every year at vintage aviation gatherings across the country, A small group of men in their 60s and 70s huddle on a runway trying to coax a 50-year-old Cox back to life, adjusting the needle valve by feel, flicking the propeller with practiced hands, waiting for that sound. When it finally catches, when the engine spits and coughs and then suddenly finds its note and climbs into that high, screaming whine that carries across a field like nothing else in the world, the men standing around it smile in a way that has nothing to do with the engine and everything to do with a Saturday morning in 1965 in a backyard, and a father who showed them how to hold their fingers away from the propeller arc. That is what the Cox .049 actually was. Not a product, not a SKU in a hobby catalog. It was the specific gravity of a particular kind of American afternoon. The smell of nitromethane on warm concrete, the sting of a miscalculated flip, the moment the plane lifted and the control lines went taut and a boy understood for the first time that he was actually flying something. You cannot put that in a box and sell it at auction. You cannot subcontract it to a facility in Colorado and expect it to survive the move. Bill Selzer knew that. Leroy Cox knew it before him. The men on the Santa Ana floor knew it every day they came to work and held the standard. The people who bought the company at the end did not know it. Or they knew it and calculated that it did not matter. In the economy of holding companies and acquisition multiples, precision is a cost center until the day it isn't. And by the time you realize what you've lost, the machine is already gone and the men who ran it have already gone home. Somewhere in a garage in the American Midwest, a Cox Babe B is sitting on a shelf in its original packaging, unflown, still waiting. The man who put it there is older now. His hands are slower, but he knows, without having to think about it, exactly how to start it. He learned that a long time ago in a backyard on a Saturday, when the afternoon stretched out ahead of him like it would never end. He keeps the engine because some things are worth keeping, even after everything stops running.